Hi, everybody. Good night. Today it's 20th August. We are having our meeting, Jung's approach to spirituality and religion, and it's a pleasure to have Lionel Cobbett with us today. Thank you, Lionel.
Thank you, Mariana. So I'm going to talk about Jung's approach to spirituality and religion and try to show in what way it's a little bit different than traditional approaches to religion. And I want to begin by asking you to imagine the kind of experiences that we read about in the Bible, because Jung has a very special way of explaining these kind of experiences. Imagine Saul on the road to Damascus, on his way to persecute Jesus's followers, and he sees a blinding light. He's thrown off his horse, and he hears Jesus's voice saying, "Why do you persecute me?" Or imagine Moses at the burning bush, which is not consumed by the flames, hearing the voice of God speaking to him. Now imagine the emotional impact, the psychological impact of a very powerful experience like that. That's the kind of experience that Jung was very interested in, but he had a different way of approaching it than traditional religionists. So this is Jung's approach. Traditional religions will talk about these kind of experiences of divinity as coming from a heavenly realm, a transcendent realm. Jung thinks it comes from, these experiences come from the deep level of the unconscious, which is a deep level of the psyche. So this is his model. It's like an iceberg here. This is everyday, ordinary, what we call ego consciousness, your ordinary, everyday personality. And then below that, you have material from childhood that we call repressed material. That's you can't call to mind automatically. Maybe it was traumatic or painful, and it's been pushed out of awareness. And now, psychoanalysis deals with that a great deal. What Jung does, which is surprising, he says that these kind of religious experiences that I've talked about in the Bible are actually coming from a deeper level of the unconscious, a deeper level of the psyche, like this model here. It has a lot of names. It's called the autonomous psyche, the mythopoetic level of the psyche. But he thinks that this is the deep level from which religious experience, spiritual experiences come. So not from a heaven, but from deeply within our own psyche. So this is a major difference. So if you were to look at his model, imagine that these little pyramids or icebergs represent everybody on the planet. So there should be 8 billion of them or something. Then all human beings have access to this deep level of the psyche, this spiritual dimension. What that means in practice is that no matter what the religious tradition is that you grew up in, that you learned about, material from this deep level may come into your consciousness in dreams or in a visionary state. I'll give some examples of that. That may be from a religion or a mythological system that you know nothing about, because it's in the collective unconscious. It's not in your individual psyche. So Jung thinks that these kind of powerful experience that he calls numinous experience, like Moses or St. Paul, arise from this deep level of the psyche. Okay. Now, just to mention the history a little bit, Jung borrowed this word numinous from this man, Rudolf Otto, who was a German Lutheran theologian, and he wrote a book in 1917 called The Idea of the Holy, and he was trying to describe these experiences like Moses at the burning bush, or Saul on the road to Damascus, or Job, the story of Job. You remember how the divine appears to him as a whirlwind, through a whirlwind, or remember the vision of Ezekiel with this tremendous divine material coming down from above. Otto used the term numinous to talk about the emotional quality of those experiences. So the important thing is not the content, it's the emotional power of the experience which is most important. This is just the Latin root of the word. The word numen in Latin means a divinity. Now, Otto said, when you look at these kind of experiences, you can tell that they are experiences of the holy or the sacred because they have this tremendously powerful emotional experience. And he was a 19th century scholar, basically. So he used this Latin phrase, mysterium tremendum et fascinans, to talk about something, what the effect would be on the subject of an experience like that. It would be overwhelming, fascinating, mysterious, awesome, dreadful, terrifying. Those are the kind of words that people use to talk about these experiences. You can imagine how Saul or Moses must have felt when they were in the face of this tremendous, overwhelming divine power. It makes the individual feel very small. Sometimes people feel, when they have these experiences, they feel blessed. It's an experience of grace. It can be terrifying. It can cause a conversion experience. The thing is, you can't make them come or go. In other words, the divine can come to us in this way. We can't just voluntarily go there. You can't make these things happen. There's no rational way to explain them. So what happened was 20 years after Otto wrote that book in 1937, Jung gave a lecture at Yale, and he said, look, I'm hearing experiences in the therapy room that have this very powerful emotional experience, but they're not Judeo-Christian, they're not biblical. They can have any content, but they have this very powerful, awesome, dreadful, mysterious quality about them. And he said, I think they are still experiences of the sacred or the holy, even if they're not traditional in their content, okay? This is just a slide which talks about some of the differences. I've already mentioned them. Otto thought they would come from a heavenly God in a heavenly realm. Jung thinks they are from contact with the divine self, which in the English language literature we write with a capital letter S. Jung thinks that the self, capital S, is the God within. He thinks that it's when you have a contact with that level, which is this deep level of the unconscious, that's when you have a numinous experience. So it's quite a difference thinking that it's within you rather than in some heavenly realm. And then this point that the manifestations, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, are sometimes the kind of thing that a traditional religionist wouldn't accept as being sacred. Okay. Now, the reason Jung thought these experiences very powerful is he thought they have a healing effect. And he said that that's the real healing factor, the real healing therapy. And what we find in clinical practice is when we hear these experiences from people, they're always talking about something that's going on in the person's life, a life crisis, a problem that the person has, or some emotional difficulty, something like that. And they are so emotionally powerful that they have this healing effect. Now, other people have written about these experiences, of course. There's a big literature. These are mystical experiences. So I just quote one other famous person. This is William James. This is from the book Varieties of Religious Experience, written, I think, 1902 or something like that. He says these experiences have these four qualities. Ineffable means it's hard to put the quality into words. They're so unusual and powerful. Noetic means that they will tell you something that you didn't know before. they give new information. Transient, they don't last long, a few seconds or a few minutes. And then passivity, because you can't make these things come or go. Once you're in the grip of an experience like that, you can't stop it happening. Well, this is just a point about Jung. Is he realized that if you are a very vulnerable kind of person and you have one of these very big experiences, it can make you crazy. It can fragment the personality. So in order not to identify the experience with the experience, he likes people to express it in some way, write about it, paint, do a painting of the experience. And in that way, you can get into a relationship with it. I think I'll miss this. These are, not everybody liked this idea, and these are some of the criticisms. Some people say, well, you know, St. Paul on the road to Damascus was having a temporal lobe epileptic seizure, or these kinds of experiences are hysterical or imaginary, or how do you know they're experiences of the sacred or the holy? Maybe there's some other, and so there are some psychoanalytic experiences like this one. Donald Capps says, a numinous experience like this is just an infantile memory of being picked up by a parent or something like that. So I'm not going to go into that very much because I think they're wrong. There are different ways in which these experiences can occur. They can occur in dreams. I'm going to give you a dream example in a minute, or synchronistic events, which I'll be happy to talk about, and sometimes as a waking vision, and a few other ways. But here's a numinous dream. Now, what you'll hear from this dream is that it's emotionally very powerful. It's very mysterious, but it's not Judeo-Christian. It's not biblical, obviously. But because of the emotional power of the dream, Jung would say it is an experience of this transpersonal, objective, spiritual level of the unconscious. And I mentioned that these experiences have a healing effect. And this was a woman who had what in Jungian psychology we call the mother complex. She had a very difficult, negative mother who devalued her and was very critical of her, didn't like her body, didn't like anything feminine, and so on. So she grew up with a very low opinion of herself, a low opinion of women, and so on. So that was her mother complex. And this is her dream. I'm in a glass elevator with no cables, heading up into space. The sky is clear blue and I can see for hundreds of miles. So immediately you get the sense that you're going into a kind of a spiritual dimension here. I'm pressed up against a group of beautiful otherworldly women who are swaying and singing a mesmerizing melody, a hypnotic melody. We are naked. They lift me up, they hold me, stroke me, and embrace me. They sing of love, compassion, and forgiveness. There's a feeling of intimacy. They begin dripping honey on me that feels loving and sweet. I'm filled with incredible peace and joy beyond words or description. Now you see, that dream has the very powerful emotional quality. It was awesome and mysterious to the dreamer, and it gave her this tremendous feeling of peace and joy. And it directly addressed this mother complex, but obviously it's not Judeo-Christian. Now, one of the moves that Jung makes is he says you can take an image in the dream and you can see how has this image been used in other religious systems, in mythological systems throughout human history. And in this case, I'm interested in the word honey here because these otherworldly women are dripping honey on the dreamer. And that's very important because in the religions of antiquity of the goddesses like Aphrodite and Artemis and so on in ancient Greece, they experienced honey as a tremendous mystery because, you know, the bee takes pollen and converts it into food. And they thought this was an example of the mysterious transformative power of the goddess or Mother Nature. Like just as a woman takes in food and makes breast milk, this is was such a tremendous mystery to them that they associated honey with the divine feminine, with the great mother of mythology, with the goddess, basically. So they used honey as an initiatory meal when they were initiating priestesses into the religions of the goddess. They would use honey as the initiatory meal. So in other words, there's an allusion here or a hint to the fact that this woman is having an initiatory experience. What that means, initiation in this context means she's being taken to a new level of consciousness, something that she had never thought of, that somehow she could participate in the divine feminine. So rather than her sort of devalued aspect of femininity, here she's being initiated into a very high level of divine femininity. So this dream, when you work on it a little bit, you see has a tremendously numinous or powerful effect on the dreamer. That's why Jung says it has a healing effect. So I just summarize that here. It's mysterious, tremendous, fascinating, but not Judeo-Christian. And the thing about these experiences like this dream is that they're so powerful. That's why they are helpful. Now, this is another example of the fact that you can experience imagery in a dream, for example, or in a vision that has nothing to do with the religion that you were raised in, because of this deep level of the psyche, you see. And this is an example of this. This was the dream of a friend of mine who was a Franciscan priest, been in the order all his life. And to his great surprise, he had a dream of this figure, okay? So this is a very traditional Roman Catholic guy. And all of a sudden he has this dream. Now this figure it's called the Venus of Willendorf. Willendorf is a town in Austria, and these are small clay figures that are thought to be the earliest goddess figures known. They're from old Europe, about 25,000-30,000 years ago. And you can see that they're goddess symbols or fertility symbols. This looks like she's pregnant, big breasts. As I say, so they are pagan, way pre-Christian symbols of the divine feminine. So what was this doing in the psyche of a Roman Catholic priest and he said in the dream that he's holding a communion cup, and this figure in the dream is in the sky above him, and it's enormous, although the figures themselves are quite small. They're only about 5 inches tall, and they're made of clay. But in the dream, it was a huge figure in the sky. And he said in the dream, I held this up the cup, and then milk started to pour from the breast of the goddess into the cup. And he said, I felt like I was in the presence of something intensely holy. Now, this was an enormous surprise to this man. But this is what James meant when he used that word noetic. It gave this man some new information. It says that what's really sacred to you is the divine feminine. So he's been worshiping the Christian God all his life, and all of a sudden it's as if he's being introduced to the mysteries of the divine feminine, but not through the Blessed Virgin Mary, through this is the earliest divine feminine figure that we have. So this was an enormous surprise to him. And I said to him, did you tell anyone in the order? And he said, no, I didn't want to, because, he'd get into trouble if he told people about this, because, you're not supposed to dream about the wrong thing. And I'm going to stop sharing now. This is why, sorry, I just want to stop this slideshow. this is why the traditional religions are not very keen on Jung's approach, because of this idea that you can experience numinous imagery that's not official, that doesn't really belong to the tradition that you were raised in. And sometimes you can get imagery in your dreams, for example, that actually contradicts the tradition. So I remember a dream in which Jesus appears to the dreamer as a woman, but it's clearly Jesus. And when she told her minister about this, he said, well, since Jesus was a man, not a woman, this dream must have been sent to you by the devil to confuse you, which is misunderstanding the symbolic nature of this kind of material. It's not literal. That was a teaching to her, telling her that she's sort of been overemphasizing the masculinity of the divine, and that the divine has masculine and feminine aspects and so on. So we never take this kind of material literally. We take it always symbolically, metaphorically, to see what the teaching is in the experience. But because of the fact that Jung would accept even very unusual imagery as numinous experiences of the sacred or the holy, he had a lot of conflict with traditional theologians about this that we could talk about if you want. Now, another, so the dream is a very important manifestation of the numinous. Another very important manifestation are what we call visionary experiences. And in a visionary experience is very much like a dream, except the subject is awake. If you can imagine having a dream, but the dream imagery, instead of being sort of in your mind, is sort of out there. You're seeing it as if it was externalized. And so these experiences can be very powerful. I mean, you could call the experiences of Saul and Moses and Ezekiel and Isaiah, there are lots of them in the Bible. These are all visionary experiences. And you get them in all traditions, of course. Muhammad writing the Quran, taking dictation from the angel Gabriel, and so on. You find them in all the Abrahamic traditions. But Jung's point is that these kind of experiences with this quality are still occurring. They're not confined to the Bible. And they don't necessarily take a biblical form, okay? So I'll give you an example of my own, of a visionary experience. And this happened to me about 13 years ago, just before an illness that I had. At the time of the experience, I didn't know I was going to have the illness. But so in this experience, I was lying on my bed. I was definitely not asleep. This was a waking experience. And suddenly a figure appeared by my bed, and it was a tall, gray figure. It looked like it was made of stone, except it seemed more alive than that. And that was terrifying, mysterious, tremendous, fascinating, and so on. But then when I looked up, the figure was looking down at me. And the really terrifying thing was that it had three faces. It had a face looking down and a face coming from either side of its head. Okay. It didn't last very long, but it was extremely frightening. So it meets all these Otto's criteria and Jung's criteria. It's mysterious, tremendous, awesome, dreadful, and so on, uncanny, but not biblical, obviously. So I didn't know what to make of this. But when I looked into, one has to do a little research with this kind of experience, it turns out that in many religious traditions, there are figures that have either three heads or three faces. They're called tricephalic gods or goddesses. So you get Hecate, the Buddha, sometimes with three heads or three faces, the The Hindu have a trinity like that with 3 heads or 3 faces. And various traditions. Well, so anyway, to cut a long story short, finally I decided that this was a figure from Greco-Roman mythology called Hermes Mercury, who was often depicted as having these, what's called this tricephalic 3-head or 3-face quality. Now, this is a figure in Greek mythology who was a herald. He was a messenger god. So in that mythology, when the gods on Olympus wanted to talk to human beings, they would send Hermes Mercury as a messenger. Excuse me. So, but I didn't know what the message was. But then shortly after that, I became very ill. So then I realized in retrospect that this was a message that something was about to happen. And why that particular figure? Well, there you have to look into another symbol system, and you can't do this without Jungian psychology. Jung, when he studied the ancient alchemists, he discovered that they used this figure of Hermes Mercury to talk about the spirit in matter, the spirit in nature. The alchemists didn't believe that matter, ordinary material reality, was inert. They thought there was a soul or a spirit in matter. And that to talk about that, they used this term Hermes Mercury. They called it the spirit Mercurius. So it was as if the spirit was in matter. They didn't like the traditional idea that somehow matter was dead or inert. They liked the idea that matter has a spirit in it. So since this was an illness in the body, I think that's why this particular figure came, because it had to do, it was like telling me that somehow this, what was a bodily affliction, was not just some inert, meaningless event, but had some kind of spiritual or soulful aspect or element to it. Anyway, that's a rather brief summary of it. But what I found is that many people have these kind of waking visionary experiences. They're just reluctant to talk about it because, you know, we don't like to go around saying I had a vision because it makes us sound a little bit crazy. It's all right to say I had a dream, but not to say I had a vision. But people do have these experiences. It may be that somebody in this group has had a waking vision like that. So I'll give you another example from my clinical practice. This was an example of a man who was very severely depressed. And he felt hopeless and lonely and so on. And he had this experience. I'm going to read his experience. He said, a huge thick curtain came down around me. I was then lifted up and taken to the top of a high mountain. The mountain was ancient, but then surrounding me, sitting among the rocks, were the shadowy forms of the hosts of heaven, angelic presences, and they gathered round him. And he said, I knew they had gathered there in order to meet me. They seemed to be expecting me and to delight in my presence. Then he said, a soft white glow radiated around me, and I felt a deep warmth and a sense of belonging. And he said, for that moment, I felt I was heaven's agenda. Now, that was a very powerful visionary experience. And it alleviated his depression because he no longer felt alone and unseen. He realized that he had this divine or this angelic presence around him, which was, of course, an enormous help. Now, one of the difficulties with this approach, Jung would say, well, that's a vision that's arising from this deep level of the psyche. And he would take it at face value. He would say, you must listen to that and take it seriously and so on. Now, suppose this man, he brought it to me, but suppose this man would have taken it to a therapist who was an atheist, who didn't believe that there is a spiritual dimension or that there are spiritual beings. And this happens, unfortunately. An atheistic therapist or a psychiatrist, would say, look, you're hallucinating, or you imagined it, or what were you smoking? That they would dismiss this. This is what's called reduction. When you say it's not a genuine experience of the holy or the sacred, it's nothing but your mind making this up. And that has, when that is said to people who have these experiences, which I'm afraid is not uncommon, it's very harmful. It's very painful to the experiencer. So I wish I could spread the word about this to more therapists. Annie and I have been trying to do this with a lot of our talks around the world. I don't know if we've succeeded, but we're trying. Because therapists most of them don't know Jung, and they don't realize that there is a way to understand these experiences by thinking about them as arising from this spiritual level of the psyche. So I'm quite worried about these experiences not being taken seriously. Now, sometimes these kind of numinous experiences are absolutely terrifying. Well, I think Saul on the road to Damascus, when he had that experience, must have been terrified. I know I was. But sometimes you get a dream which has this numinous quality that's quite terrifying. So I brought one of these terrifying numinous dreams. And again, it was a dream of a woman who had a very difficult mother problem. Her mother was very critical and harsh and angry and so on. And in the dream, she sees the head of her mother, just the head, not the body. And the head, instead of covered with hair, is covered in snakes, like the Gorgon or the Medusa. That story in Greek mythology, the Medusa that could turn people to stone. And in the dream, the head of her mother, covered in snakes, is chasing the dreamer, and the dreamer is running and running, and she can't escape. Now that's a mythological image of what we call the mother complex. The dream was actually terrifying, but at the same time, it had this mysterious, numinous quality about it. So that's just to show you that sometimes these experiences, although they're very numinous, they can also be quite terrifying. One of the other very common examples of numinous dreams is when you have a dream image or a vision of a person who's recently died. Now, this is a controversial area. So I'm thinking of a woman who had a very difficult alcoholic father. I didn't even go into all the details. He was very unpleasant. So we did a lot of the usual kind of work that you do in therapy. We worked on this father problem. And then she had a dream in which her father comes to her in the dream and apologizes to her for his behavior. Okay. And that was enormously powerful and healing and numinous for this woman. But and sometimes people will have this kind of experience of a dead relative as a waking vision. You'll just see the dead person out there, the foot of your bed or something. I've heard many examples like that. Now, of course, depends on your belief system. If you believe, as I do, that the soul of the deceased person can come and visit you, that the soul continues to evolve, I'm sure many people here will believe that as well, then one can say that this is simply a visit from the soul of the deceased person who's learned and is now visiting and so on. But if you don't believe that there is any continuity of consciousness after death, then when you hear this kind of visionary experience or dream experience of a dead person, it tends to get dismissed as just sort of the healing effect of the psychotherapy, as if this woman's father complex had somehow gotten improved by the psychotherapy, rather than, of course, both could be true at the same time, but a lot of therapists will not see this as a visit from the dead person. So this is where the therapist's values and beliefs can really influence what he or she says in psychotherapy. And I think it's very important for us to sort of talk about the fact that these experiences, if you do believe in a spiritual dimension and the continuity after death in some way, that these things can simply be taken as just so. This is the way it is. But unfortunately, in our profession, this is commonly dismissed. That, you know, people, when they have a visionary experience, they're told that they're hysterical or an overheated imagination and so on. But, well, I'll give you some more visionary experiences. And again, they're not always Judeo-Christian. I'm thinking of a woman who was an intensive care unit nurse, and she was the kind of person that felt that how can I put it? It was like the only reason she had to be on the planet was to serve other people, to help other people. She felt she was no good unless she was helping other people. Okay. But what had happened to her, the reason she was in therapy was that she's kind of burnt out. She'd exhausted herself with this long hours in the intensive care unit, and trying so hard and so on, but very burnt out and exhausted. So in the experience, she's lying in bed, and she said, I knew I was not dreaming. She was wide awake. She says, suddenly I was aware of light at the foot of the bed. Light, by the way, in all these kind of experiences is a very common symbol. Light and fire usually are common, like fire with Moses and light with Saul. They're very common symbolic manifestations of the sacred or the holy. So she said, suddenly I was aware of light at the foot of the bed. And the light expanded, and she said it was just floating like an oval in the dark. And she said, these are her words, I was fearful and fascinated and awestruck. Now, those are the language of the numinous, Otto's language, you see. But she hadn't read Otto or Jung, but she just was able to use those words. And she said, I was sure I was not dreaming. And then she said, this light spoke without words, which is very common in these experiences, and identified itself as the compassionate heart. It didn't say it was the heart of Jesus or the heart of the Buddha. It just said the compassionate heart. And then she said, a loving presence filled the room and flooded me. And then the oval of light shot a beam of light directly into my heart. And then in that moment, I'm just reading her words, I saw myself with divinely compassionate eyes, and I was filled with a sense of forgiveness, unconditional love, and complete self-acceptance. And then this silent voice told her that she didn't need to do anything. She didn't need to work so hard. She was worthwhile just as she was, without having to exhaust herself serving other people. And she said, I saw the moments when I had judged myself as lovable only because I was living from out of love and service to others. But this voice directly told her that wasn't true, that she was valuable in her own right. Now, I was able to affirm the reality of that experience, that this was a visit from the spiritual dimension. and it can be taken exactly at face value. And now I could have told her exactly what the voice said, and I could have said that to her till I was blue in the face. It wouldn't have had the same effect as this very powerful numinous presence had. You see, it's the emotional power of the experience which has the healing effect. Well, I'll just give you another one. I don't know if you want me to keep going with this. I've got many more examples, or we could stop for questions. What do you think, Annie?
I think we should go on a little bit more with more examples.
More examples? Okay. I do have several more, but I didn't want to flood people with too much material. Okay, so I'll tell you a few more. So this was an experience of a woman who'd been very severely abused in childhood. She grew up in a family where she was very alone and felt completely unloved and unable to love other people because she'd never experienced love. I think it was a family dog that she got very close to that saved her life as a child. She was close to this family dog, and she was going through a very painful episode in her life, and she said, this is what happened. She's lying on her bed. Again, she's quite sure she's awake. And a figure appeared, and the figure was dressed in a long, dark, heavy robe, with a brown robe with a hood. And then the figure was standing on her pelvic bones. So she's lying in bed and the figure is standing on her. But the curious thing was that she said, I felt her presence and saw her clearly, but she was weightless. There was no weight. That's rather important. Then she said, my heart pounded. I couldn't move, but I wasn't afraid because I sensed her deep caring and her intention to help me. Then the figure leaned forward, and with her, I'm just going to read her, with her index finger, she touched the place between my breasts adjacent to my heart. Then she started to draw up her finger, and it was as if there was a cord wrapped around my heart. And with her finger, she starts pulling this cord from around my heart. And she said, I felt my heart unbinding, and the weight around my heart was drawn away. And then the interesting thing is that as she kept pulling this cord, it got thinner and thinner as she pulled it. And finally, it became like a very, very fine, thin thread. And the figure then used this fiber to weave a kind of a cloth or a carpet. And that fell to the floor, and it turned out there was a large dark pool of water around the subject. Well, it wasn't a dream, and the figure used this cloth that she'd woven to cover this dark pool around her. And her words are, the experience permeated me so deeply that I was profoundly touched, shaken, and moved. Now, again, you see, this is very numinous. You can hear that from her language. And the metaphor is obvious. It was the unbinding of the heart. Her heart had been constricted by her painful childhood, so she couldn't feel anything from the heart. And now the figure unbound the heart. And the interesting thing is that, and it had a very beneficial effect on her. The interesting thing to me was that the figure had no weight, that it was standing on her pelvis, but there was no weight to it. So what we'd have to say is that this was a subtle body experience, not a physical body, but a kind of a spiritual body. You know that all the traditions have the notion of a spiritual body, somewhere in between the physical gross body and the pure spirit. The spiritual body or the subtle body usually can't be seen with ordinary vision. But this is the kind of experience that makes us believe that there is such a thing. Another way of looking at this is that this is what's been called the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal realm. It's the realm of the deep psyche. And when you have one of these kind of experiences, you see that the information that you get is very real. The information that you get and the effects of it are as real as the information that you get from the five senses and from your intellect. So these are very, very important experiences. They cannot be dismissed. I'll give you another one. And sometimes you hear experiences that really will aid in a person's spiritual evolution. I'm thinking of a guy who was very immersed in the Christian mystical tradition, very sincerely immersed in that tradition. And he said, his words, "I woke up, so this wasn't a dream, and I felt a sense of presence in the room." This, by the way, is another one of these mysteries. Sometimes you feel a sense of a spiritual presence. You tend to feel it at special moments like marriages, deaths, and births, but you get a sense of some presence in the room. And the interesting thing is that since you don't experience it through the five senses, you can't see it or hear it and so on. I've often wondered, how do we feel that presence? But if you've experienced it, you'll know what I'm talking about. One of the theories is that it's felt in the heart, that the heart is a kind of an organ, maybe the heart chakra is the organ that allows us to feel this presence. Anyway, that's by the way. So he didn't say all that. That was just my addition. He said, "I awoke with an overwhelming sense of a presence. And then suddenly a tone, a noise began and a light appeared. The noise got louder and the size of the light got bigger, and the light became a sphere, a ball. And then the globe of light ended up about 5 feet in diameter, very bright, very hard to look at. And then from the center of the light, I heard a voice say, 'Jesus,' and the ball of light moved towards me," he says, "striking me with a force that gently rocked me, gently. Then everything disappeared, the room became quiet and dark, and then another tone and dot of light appeared, that the same thing happened. And then this time the voice in the light said, 'Christ,' and the light flew into me and then disappeared. And then there was more silence, and then a third noise and dot of light appeared. And this time, when the light flew into him, it was completely silent. And then he said, then everything returned to normal, and I was left awestruck." That's his word. See, these are people who haven't read Jung and Otto. They use this language because these experiences are so mysterious. And he said to me, "Well, I understand Jesus and Christ, but why was the third ball of light silent?" And I realized that he had reached a level of spiritual attainment that this was a teaching, you see. He was being taught that there is an aspect of the divine that cannot be named, cannot be spoken, that he should now be in his meditation in a non-conceptual experience of pure silence with no name and no form. He was beyond name and form. So this was a very powerful teaching experience. Can I stop or shall I go on? I don't want to overdo it. I do have more examples, but maybe they're all more of the same quality.
So what do you people prefer? In the
Questions?
chat, we have
Yeah.
only one question by now.
Oh, okay. Well, I would be very interested in knowing if anybody in this group has had a visionary experience like this. I don't know whether you'd feel comfortable talking about it or not. Some people are shy about it, which is why I talked about my own. but, you know, so don't feel any pressure, obviously, but if you don't mind sharing it, it would be very interesting.
Should we start with the experience? Because it's being recorded.
Okay.
So
Oh,
if
you want to start recording?
yeah, if people, for instance, we can first answer questions and then stop the recording, and then people
Oh,
can
okay.
tell their own experiences. I
Yeah.
think maybe this is better.
Okay.
So I don't know, Sylvia and Bianca, would you like to share an experience or ask a question? Because Mariana has put a question here in the chat.
I share an experience which I had more than one, but
Okay, so
we can
we'll
answer the
leave for
question.
later then.
I can do later. Yes, that's fine.
Okay. What about you, Bianca, also?
Same to Sylvia. I will share
Okay.
experience and
Okay. So I think we should first answer questions, Lionel. So Mariana has put here in the chat.
Yes.
Is there a difference between the experience of the numinous and an experience of ecstasy?
Yeah. Ecstatic experiences are one type of numinous experience. You remember that in the tradition of the Upanishads, the sacred books of India, they talk about the divine as being, consciousness, and bliss. I'm assuming that ecstasy and bliss are very similar. So ecstasy or bliss is definitely one manifestation of the numinous. It's one type. But you know, I talked about the fact that sometimes it can be terrifying. It's not always pleasant. But the answer is yes, I think.
Okay, Lana, I would like you, if you could give us your opinion and clarify a little bit, because in the Spiritist knowledge, okay,
Yeah.
We study a lot about mediumship.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, people that are medium are different types of mediumship, but many of them can see spirits or hear voices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of mentors or of spirits. So, and that's why I think we should help and clarify. For instance, you talked about waking visionary experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, and you're giving a lot of examples. For instance, the example of the subtle body, right? The unbinding of the heart, the figure that was in a subtle body. For instance, let's think together. If the person was a spiritist and was a medium, for instance, the person could, of course, understand through spiritist knowledge that she or he was seeing a spirit, okay? But it wouldn't be wrong to think about that.
No, that's perfectly, yeah, that's fine, yeah, not wrong.
Yeah, but then what it's not very commonly talked about in spiritist knowledge is about the emotional quality, the healing effect, and the numinous in the experience. For instance, the symbolic way that or the symbolic expression, let's say, of an issue that it's a teaching of what's being given to the person. What can you clarify and tell us a little more about that?
Well, the symbolic level is very important because, like for example, I talked about the symbol of honey as being a symbol of the transformative power of Mother Nature. You know, if you didn't think symbolically, you just think about honey as some kind of sweet, sticky stuff. It wouldn't have any, but it has a much larger meaning, you know. So that's why the symbolic approach is very important. I mean, sometimes, you can take these figures literally, like the women in, remember that elevator dream? Those women could have been spiritual figures. I think they were myself.
Mm.
But you could think of them as symbolic of the spirit of the divine feminine or something like that. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Annie.
Yes, you are doing it, because it's just a way for us to think together, you know, because Joana de Angelis brings the importance of the symbolism, the psychology, and she's trying to make a bridge between everything that we know about psychology, about this dimension of the psyche, but also the spiritual knowledge. Okay, so for instance, what I'm thinking here and trying to share with you, and wanted very much for you to give your opinion, is that even a spirit in a mediumistic session, for instance, seance, that we are trying to help people, usually are trying to help spirits that communicate or channel message teachings, things like that, okay? But many times there would be, for instance, a symbolic vision or expression of even of the spirit, okay? And maybe it could be missed because the phenomena gets to be more important, for
Oh,
instance.
so they miss the symbolic level of it.
Yeah, miss the symbolic level, the psychological level. And I think Joana de Angelis is trying to bring all of this and put everything together. It doesn't matter that if we are in a body of flesh or in a body of a subtle body, as one of your examples, that many times the communication will be symbolic. For instance, as you said, light or fire. And if I don't understand, or the silence, the beautiful example of Jesus and the Christ, and then the silence. Okay, well, what happened? Why the silence now? So am I not hearing anything? For instance, if I'm looking at the experience and in a concrete way without the symbolic, okay? And then, as you said, well, the silence is a teaching, is a spiritual teaching, and it's saying something about the divine. So what I think is that Joana is so important because she's trying to put her teachings, she's trying to connect everything, and she's using a lot of Jung, because the psychological part of the of not only the spiritual dimension, but the way that we communicate, the way that even we practice mediumship for mediums, has to evolve in a sense of understanding the psychological part, and also, of course, that is connected the symbolic nature of the expression of the spirit, even if the spirit is in flesh or in
But can
the
I ask
subtle
you a
body.
question? Would Joanna, I mean, she was in the Christian tradition, would she accept the idea that these experiences may not take a traditional form? Because that's
Yes,
a big issue. That was what Jung quarreled with, with Martin Buber and Victor White and all kinds of theologians.
yeah, that's totally Joanna. That's why she keeps bringing she talks about the Upanishads and other cultures.
Okay, so she's okay with it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, totally. I hope I'm well from everything that I've read by now, and she appears as well. I don't want to give spoilers because it's the last class of the our course here, but the many incarnations that she talks about with Divaldo that she has had. But of course, we have to look at the spirit and why. Of course, she had other incarnations, but why is she pointing out those incarnations? So I'm already giving spoilers in advance because when Joanna is saying, oh, look at this and that incarnation, people here in Brazil, for instance, we have a lot of Catholics, and the basis of the, the religion for many, many decades were Catholic. So many people think, oh, she has been, I don't want to give spoiler, but she has been a religion person and this and that. But sometimes I think that people can miss the example that the spirit is giving. Why that spirit comes, in a rank, in my life as a priest, as a nun, as this and that. There is a meaning, and sometimes it's also a symbolic meaning. Many times is a symbolic meaning when it means a teaching. That's what I wanted to, because you gave beautiful examples. And many times in Chico Xavier psychographs, especially the one by André Luiz, the medical doctor, there are lots of examples of people waking up and remembering dreams where they were quite sure they encountered a spirit of a deceased relative, but the way they remember was symbolic.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, there would be a figure, a snake, or this and that.
Yeah.
And could you say something about that?
You mean that they might see a bird, for example, and think that that was the spirit of a parent or something? Yeah. Well, I mean, people have that kind of experience quite commonly. It's an intuitive association that has symbolic meaning. I think that's important. I think those intuitions are reliable. I don't know what more you want me to say. I'm sort of agreeing with you.
No, I don't agree. And what about the emotional, the numinous, right?
Oh, it still has a very emotional quality. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so you would say that when there is an encounter, let's say that this vision of the subtle, the spirit, let's say, in the subtle body that was that made the carpet, right,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
for the person. For instance, it was the unbinding of the
Of the
heart.
heart. Yeah. Well, that's symbolic, obviously. Yeah.
Obviously. And what about the carpet?
Well, I said to her, you know, that dark pool around you, that's probably your depression. And the figure was giving her something to get through the depression, covering it with this fabric. That was the symbolic meaning of that fabric.
Okay, thank you. That's why I wanted you to.
Oh, yeah,
give
I should have said that. Okay, yeah, right. Well, that's where in therapy you can make those symbolic links. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm trying to bring to people that are spiritists, the importance of paying attention to the whole of the experience.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, there is Andre Marie. Do you want me to read? Hi. So do you want me to read, or do you want to read to Lionel?
I can summarize. Thank you.
Okay.
I since I raised my hand, so much has gone on. I'm just going to go with the current feeling here. And I do have something to share, but I'm also happy to listen to other people's sharing, because I think this is a group that has a lot of numinous experiences. But to your point on and Lionel, what you were agreeing with, that in just even the most basic of experiences for somebody in a client practice, the beauty of somebody reporting, like having the courageousness to report.
Yeah, just take courage. Yes,
right.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that they've had an experience that has provided them with some missing experience from their childhood or wherever it was their care was negligent. So it fills up a missing experience, like the gentleman that said he felt he was on heaven's agenda. You know, if you
Yeah.
believe in heaven, right? I mean, is there a better agenda if you believe in heaven?
Well, I mean, and if you think you're lonely and all alone, and then you're surrounded by angels, that's not bad, is it?
It's not bad.
So, you know,
Yeah, that was an incredible example. And just that
Yeah.
healing feeling that is so personal, you know? So
yeah,
I don't know what, you know, Jung had a lot to say, right, about angels and images in the psyche, but they are ultimately just so personal. And even more interesting, I find, is when you're not raised with a certain religion, but that image comes to you in a vision or a dream.
yeah, and that
And-
happens. Yeah,
Yeah,
that happens. Yeah.
thank
Yeah,
you.
I have
Thank
more
you.
examples of people who get visionary experiences from a tradition that's not their own, like the Venus of Willendorf. Yeah. Anyway, I'd rather hear other people's experiences, I think, at this point.
Yeah, so I think, Mariana, we can stop sharing and say goodbye to everyone that is watching later. And then we are going to be sharing the experiences here.